On October 5, 2010, three teenage boys set out from Atafu, a tiny coral atoll in Tokelau, a remote territory of New Zealand in the South Pacific. The boys were Samu Perez, 15 years old, Filo Filo, 14 years old, and Etueni Nasau, also 15. They were close friends who had grown up together on the small island, where fishing was a way of life. The population of Atafu was less than 600 people. Everyone knew everyone. The boys had borrowed a small aluminum dinghy with an outboard motor to go fishing in the waters near the atoll. It was a routine trip, the kind they had made dozens of times before. The waters around Tokelau were rich with tuna and other fish. The boys planned to catch enough for their families and return before dark. They carried minimal supplies, some water, a little food, basic fishing gear. They did not carry a radio, a GPS device, or emergency flares. Such equipment was rare on Atafu. Most fishing trips lasted only a few hours. There was no reason to prepare for disaster. By midday, they had motored several miles from the atoll, reaching their favorite fishing grounds. The ocean was calm. The sky was clear. They dropped their lines and began to fish. By late afternoon, the boys decided it was time to head home. They had caught enough fish. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Samu reached for the outboard motor and pulled the starter cord. Nothing happened. He pulled again. And again. The engine refused to start. The boys examined the motor but could not identify the problem. They were fishermen, not mechanics. The engine was simply dead. They tried paddling, using their hands and pieces of wood, but the aluminum dinghy was heavy and the current was strong. They made no progress. As the sun set, they realized the terrible truth of their situation. They were adrift in the open Pacific Ocean with no power, no radio, and no way to signal for help. Atafu was already invisible on the horizon. The current was carrying them steadily westward, away from their home, away from any shipping lanes, away from everything. That first night, they sat in the darkness and listened to the vast silence of the ocean. They told each other that someone would come looking for them in the morning. Their families would notice they were missing. Search boats would be sent. They just had to wait. They did not know that they would be waiting for 50 days. Back on Atafu, the families realized something was wrong when the boys did not return by nightfall. By the next morning, search parties were organized. Small boats fanned out from the atoll, scanning the surrounding waters. But the Pacific Ocean is vast beyond comprehension. Tokelau sits isolated in the middle of nowhere, over 300 miles from the nearest significant landmass. The search boats had limited range, limited fuel, limited time. They searched for days, covering as much area as their resources allowed. They found nothing. The boys had already drifted far beyond the search radius. The ocean current had carried them steadily northwest, away from Tokelau, away from any likely rescue route. New Zealand authorities were notified. The Royal New Zealand Air Force deployed aircraft to search a wider area. But the Pacific is unimaginably large. Finding a small aluminum dinghy in millions of square miles of open water is nearly impossible. After several weeks, the official search was suspended. The three boys were presumed dead. Memorial services were held on Atafu. The small community mourned the loss of three of its children. Families wept. Prayers were offered. But somewhere out on the Pacific, Samu Perez, Filo Filo, and Etueni Nasau were still alive. They were drifting, starving, and slowly dying. But they were alive. The boys quickly established survival routines. They had no choice. Water was their most critical need. They had brought only a small amount, which ran out within the first few days. After that, they depended entirely on rain. When storms came, they collected water in any container they had, drinking desperately and storing what they could. When the skies were clear, they suffered. Days would pass without rain. Their mouths would crack. Their bodies would weaken. But the Pacific is known for sudden squalls, and each one brought temporary relief. Food was less difficult. The ocean around them teemed with life. They caught fish with their basic hand lines, eating the flesh raw. They caught small sharks that came to investigate the boat. They ate everything, the meat, the eyes, the liver. Nothing was wasted. When fish were scarce, they caught seabirds that landed on the boat to rest, wringing their necks and consuming them raw. The taste was terrible, but protein was protein. Samu and Filo adapted to this brutal existence. They were young, strong, and determined to survive. But Etueni struggled. From the beginning, he had difficulty keeping food down. Whether from illness or psychological distress, his body rejected what they gave him. While his friends grew thinner but remained functional, Etueni grew weaker every day. The days blurred together. The boys lost track of time, uncertain whether a week had passed or a month. The sun rose and set. The stars wheeled overhead. The boat drifted on currents they could not see or control. They had no idea where they were. They had no idea if they were moving toward land or away from it. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no landmarks, no hope, no mercy. They talked to pass the time. They remembered their families, their homes, their village. They made promises about what they would do if they survived. Samu and Filo grew closer, leaning on each other for emotional support. They prayed together, drawing on the Christian faith that was central to life in Tokelau. They sang hymns when they had the strength, their voices carrying across the empty water. Etueni participated when he could, but his condition continued to deteriorate. By the end of the second week, he could barely move. His eyes grew hollow. His breathing became shallow. His friends gave him the best portions of food and water, sacrificing their own rations in an attempt to keep him alive. It was not enough. The sea was taking him, slowly and inexorably. And there was nothing they could do but watch. Etueni Nasau died sometime during the third week of their ordeal. The exact date was unknown to his friends. They had lost all sense of time. One morning they tried to wake him and could not. His body had simply given up. Samu and Filo were devastated. Etueni had been their friends since childhood. They had grown up together, played together, fished together. Now he was gone, and they were alone with his body in a small boat in the middle of nowhere. They could not bury him. There was no land, no soil, no grave. After a day of mourning and prayer, they made the only choice they could. They lowered Etueni's body over the side of the boat and released him into the Pacific. They watched him sink beneath the surface and disappear. The ocean that had killed him now claimed him completely. The two surviving boys sat in silence for hours afterward. The loss was crushing. But they could not afford to stop fighting. They had made a promise to Etueni that they would survive, that they would return home, that they would tell his family what had happened. That promise became their reason to keep going. They would honor their friend by living. They would not let his death be meaningless. Samu and Filo continued to drift. The days stretched into weeks. Their bodies grew thinner, their skin darker and more weathered. Saltwater sores developed on their legs and backs from constant contact with the wet aluminum hull. Their lips cracked and bled. Their hair became matted with salt, but they refused to give up. They caught fish when they could. They prayed for rain when their water ran low. They talked about home, about their families, about what they would eat when they returned. These conversations became a ritual, a way of maintaining hope when hope seemed absurd. Sometimes they saw ships on the horizon, distant shapes that appeared and then vanished without ever coming close. They would stand and wave frantically, shouting until their voices gave out. But the ships never saw them. A small aluminum dinghy is nearly invisible on the open ocean, especially from miles away. Each missed opportunity was crushing. But they kept watching the horizon, kept hoping that the next ship would be different. They also saw aircraft occasionally, tiny specks crossing the sky far above. They waved at those too, knowing it was futile. The Pacific was too vast, and they were too small. Finding them would require a miracle. On the morning of their 50th day adrift, Samu and Filo saw something different on the horizon. It was a ship, like the others they had seen. But this one was not moving away. It was growing larger. It was coming toward them. At first, they did not believe it. They had been disappointed too many times. But as the minutes passed, the ship continued to approach. It was a fishing vessel, a tuna boat named the San Nikunau, operating out of Fiji. The crew had spotted something unusual on the water. They had come to investigate. Samu and Filo stood in their small boat, waving weakly, afraid to hope too strongly. Then they heard voices shouting in the distance. The ship was slowing. A smaller boat was being lowered. Rescuers were coming toward them. The two boys collapsed into each other's arms, weeping. 50 days of suffering, 50 days of fighting to survive, 50 days of watching the horizon and being ignored. It was finally over. They were pulled aboard the San Nikunau, barely able to stand. The crew gave them water and food, carefully and slowly, knowing their bodies could not handle too much at once. They were severely malnourished, dehydrated, and covered in sores. But they were alive. The San Nikunau altered its course to deliver the boys to medical care as quickly as possible. They were taken to Fiji, where they were hospitalized and treated for severe malnutrition, dehydration, and multiple infections. Doctors were amazed they had survived. 50 days in an open boat on the Pacific Ocean, with no provisions, no shelter from the sun, no means of navigation. The odds against their survival were astronomical. When news of their rescue reached Tokelau, the reaction was overwhelming. The boys had been mourned. Memorial services had been held. Families had accepted that they would never see them again. Now, impossibly, 2 of them were alive. The joy was tempered by grief for Etueni Nasau, whose body would never be recovered. His family had hoped against hope that all 3 boys might have survived. The news that he had died at sea was devastating. But even in their grief, they found comfort in knowing what had happened to their son. Samu and Filo had honored their promise. They had survived to tell the story. Etueni would be remembered not as a boy who simply vanished, but as a boy who fought to live and whose friends had stayed with him until the end. Samu Perez and Filo Filo returned to Atafu as heroes. The entire atoll gathered to welcome them home. There were tears, embraces, prayers of thanksgiving. The boys who had been mourned as dead were now standing before their families, thin and scarred but alive. The celebration was mixed with sorrow for Etueni, whose loss was felt by the entire community. A proper memorial was held, honoring him as a brave young man who had fought alongside his friends until his body could fight no more. In the months that followed, Samu and Filo slowly recovered. Their bodies healed. Their weight returned. The physical scars faded. But the psychological marks remained. They had experienced something that few people ever endure. They had watched a friend die. They had faced the vast indifference of the ocean and somehow survived. They rarely spoke publicly about their ordeal, preferring to resume their quiet lives on the small atoll. But their story spread across the Pacific and beyond, a testament to the power of friendship, faith, and the will to survive. The small aluminum dinghy that had carried them for 50 days across the Pacific was eventually recovered. It sits today as a reminder of what 3 boys endured and what 2 of them overcame. The ocean gives nothing freely. Survival must be earned.